Good afternoon. The Judiciary Committee will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1947 as introduced for purposes of markup and move that the committee report the bill without recommendation to the House, and the clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 1947, to provide for the reform and continuation.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. And I'll begin by recognizing myself and the ranking member for opening statements. I'd like to note for members at the outset of this markup that I am making a motion to report this bill without recommendation to the House. It is important for the committee to preserve its jurisdictional prerogatives and make appropriate changes to the provisions within our jurisdiction. However, I realize that the views of the members of this committee on the 500 or so pages of the bill that are not in our jurisdiction may vary, and in that regard, we are not asking you today to make a judgment on the merits of this lengthy bill. The Federal Agricultural Reform and Risk Management Act of 2013, known as the Farm Bill, is major legislation to repeal, reform, streamline, or consolidate a host of federal agricultural programs and policies. It is legislation of substantial interest to the public, and a number of its programs are controversial. To initiate and administer the Farm Bill's programs, the legislation provides the Department of Agriculture with multiple authorities to promulgate new regulations. Ordinarily, when Congress grants rulemaking authority, new regulations are promulgated under the notice and comment procedures of the Administrative Procedure Act and the provisions of other statutes that prescribe agency procedure. In addition, new regulations typically are submitted to Congress for review under the Congressional Review Act. The Administrative Procedure Act has for decades been considered the constitution of agency rulemaking. The Congressional Review Act, meanwhile, stands as an additional means to check and balance agency rulemaking that may be inconsistent with congressional intent, excessively costly, or unsound for other reasons. These laws to govern rulemaking are some of the most important in the Judiciary Committee's jurisdiction. It is imperative that this committee keep a vigilant watch over legislation that undermines their applicability in any way. I am concerned that the Farm Bill does precisely that. Specifically, it exempts from the Administrative Procedure Act and the Congressional Review Act its highly controversial Dairy Supply Stabilization Program, its related Dairy Margin Protection Program, its conservation programs, and its authorization of the use of the Commodity Credit Corporation's funds, facilities, and authorities to implement the bill's commodities provisions. Some members support these programs, others do not. But these are major programs that will have immense impact on the public, involve substantial deployments of public funds, and impose numerous costs on the private sector. I trust that others share my concern that the Farm Bill seeks to remove rulemaking under these programs from the critical protections of the APA and the Congressional Review Act provide against errors and excesses in agency rulemakings. For this reason, I called for this markup to be held, and I intend to offer an amendment to restore the protections of the Administrative Procedure Act and the Congressional Review Act to this important legislation. And it's now my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Goodlatte. Members of the committee, I wanted everyone to know that I applaud the chairman's assertion of jurisdiction over the Administrative Procedures Act, the Congressional Review Act, and competition policy and how it impacts consumers. These are items that I believe are within our jurisdiction and should not be cavalierly overlooked. And so I support the purpose of this meeting. I join with those of us who are concerned about it. And I will not mention the fact that this is an important bill and that there are 50 million hungry Americans and that the SNAP program is in jeopardy. all items that are not in our jurisdiction. And so with that, I look forward to working with the members of the committee to move this legislation and the amendment forward as expeditiously as possible in addressing these concerns. And I ask unanimous consent to put the rest of my statement in the record.
Without objection, the gentleman's statement will be made a part of the record, as will the opening statements of all other members. And I thank Chairman Conyers for his comments.
Thank you.
I have an amendment at the desk, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1947, offered by Mr. Goodlatte, in Section 1461.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and I'll recognize myself to explain the amendment. Our colleagues on the Committee on Agriculture have written the Farm Bill to provide dramatic reforms and changes to our nation's agricultural programs. I agree that many of these programs need reform, not the least of which include our commodity programs. Given the broad changes and impacts that these programs will bring to America's farmers and ranchers and other affected entities, I believe that the public deserves a full and fair opportunity to comment on the regulations that will determine how these programs will be run. I also believe that the Department of Agriculture should take these comments into mind when they author their final regulations. That is why I believe it is necessary for this committee to take action today to ensure that these agencies promulgate these regulations under, not exempt from, the Administrative Procedure Act and the Congressional Review Act. The APA is widely regarded as the constitution of federal rulemaking. Its requirements are critical, but they are not heavy-handed. They most notably include provisions that require agencies to provide public notice and seek public comment before they promulgate new regulations, as well as provisions that enable the courts to review agencies' final decisions. The APA's requirements provide the most significant legal protections we have to date to assure that federal rulemaking is informed by public views and the relevant facts, rests faithfully on the enabling statutes that authorize rulemaking, and is not arbitrary or capricious. The Congressional Review Act likewise imposes few but important restraints on federal rulemaking. It requires new regulations to be submitted to Congress for review and potential approval, and requires important information about the details of new major regulations when those regulations are submitted to Congress. Congress, however, is provided only a short period of time in which to review new regulations. If that time elapses without a disapproval resolution having been passed, regulations become effective and enter into law. The APA and the CRA represent Congress's considered judgment that when new regulations are promulgated, these statutes should constrain agency decision-making to assure consideration of the public's views, the just rule of law, and fidelity to congressional intent. When significant regulations are created, such as those that involve new government programs or major economic burdens, it is particularly important that APA and CRA procedures be applied. This is surely the case when long-standing major federal agricultural programs are reformed or substantial new programs are created, such as in the Farm Bill. It is similarly the case when regulations would implement a program, as in the case of the Dairy Supply Stabilization Program, that is highly controversial, will have broad economic impacts, imposes private sector mandates, threatens civil penalties, and has triggered widespread opposition from consumers, producers, retailers, and exporters based on the program's expected adverse economic impacts. The Agriculture Committee's report on H.R. 1947 lacks any compelling justification to exempt any of its dairy or conservation programs from the Administrative Procedure Act or the Congressional Review Act. Accordingly, I believe that this committee should act to restore the protections of those statutes to these important areas of the Farm Bill rulemaking. My amendment accomplishes that. Because of the economic concerns that have been expressed by consumers, producers, and others across a broad spectrum of interests, my amendment also assures that the Department of Agriculture, in its Dairy Market Stabilization Program rulemakings, will examine and render determinations on key potential economic impacts of the stabilization program. Major concerns have been raised that the stabilization program will raise consumer prices, hurt milk exports, encourage milk imports, increase the costs and strain the resources of government-funded nutrition programs, and limit the growth of the domestic dairy industry by discouraging new investments for processing capacity. It is imperative that these issues be accounted for in the course of rulemaking to implement the stabilization program. Accordingly, the amendment requires the Department of Agriculture to render determinations in the rulemakings of the impacts of the stabilization program on the dairy value chain, the U.S. dairy industry's international competitiveness, and government-funded domestic and international nutrition programs. Significantly, the Farm Bill under consideration in the Senate asks the Department to study nearly identical criteria. My amendment does not make the Department's rulemaking contingent upon the results of these determinations. It does, however, assure that the Department will take these issues seriously into consideration, informed by public comment, as it establishes the stabilization regulations. Lastly, representing a large agricultural area, I also recognize that many in rural America have been frustrated by the length of time it took the Department of Agriculture to get programs from the 2008 Farm Bill off the ground. My amendment accounts for those concerns as well by setting a deadline of 9 months after enactment for interim rules on stabilization to be put in place, allowing interim rules for the other affected programs, and requiring final rules with full notice and comment no later than 1 year later. While this amendment makes important changes to preserve the APA rulemaking requirements and the Congressional Review Act, it does not solve what many believe are the fundamental problems with the Dairy Market Stabilization Program. I do not believe that the Dairy Market Stabilization and Supply Control Program for dairy should be a part of this Farm Bill. Others may disagree. However, at minimum, this Congress should ensure that those affected by this intrusive program have the right to comment on the regulations governing this program, and that Congress reserves the right to review the program under the Congressional Review Act. My amendment represents a measured and balanced response to the important procedural defects in the Farm Bill that are within the Judiciary Committee's jurisdiction, and I urge my colleagues to support the amendment and recognize the gentleman from Michigan, the ranking member, for his comments.
Thank you, Chairman Goodlatte. I think that everyone that I've discussed this with on our side accept the amendment and appreciate your efforts to accommodate some of our concerns. The amendment restores the protections of both the Administrative Procedure Act and the Congressional Review Act, and in addition requires the Secretary of Agriculture to include a determination regarding the impact of the Dairy Market Stabilization Program on various matters, including consumers and competition in domestic dairy markets. It's my understanding that this requirement is not intended to delay or hinder the Secretary's rulemaking authority under the bill, nor is it intended to be used as a legal challenge to the rules required to be promulgated under H.R. 1947. And as one who has very little farm area in his congressional district, I have not carefully gone through the 575 pages that constitute H.R. 1947, but nevertheless urge the support of this amendment, and I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Of course.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I just want to make a point that I neglected. I've been informed that the American Farm Bureau Federation advises that it supports this amendment, and I think that will be helpful for those concerned about what impact it may have on the implementation of regulations after the Farm Bill is adopted and becomes law. Are there additional members who seek recognition? The gentlewoman from Washington is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I oppose this amendment because of the impact on the Dairy Security Act. In addition to serving on this committee, I'm honored to serve on the Agriculture Committee. And first, I have a report by a respected voice in agriculture from the University of Missouri. I'd like to ask for unanimous consent to have this included in the record.
Without objection, it will be made part of the record.
Thank you. This report talks about the impact of the Dairy Security Act on farm-level milk prices and says they may rise only 1/2 of 1 cent per gallon because of the Dairy Security Act. In addition, the current volatility in the market is far more harmful to consumers than that change. Recently, the Agriculture Committee held an all-day markup of the Farm Bill where there were extensive policy discussions on a number of issues, including the Dairy Security Act. And while the overall bill is certainly not a perfect bill, the Dairy Security Act is one of the most crucial elements. There's already been a lengthy debate about the need for new dairy policy, and that took place in the Agriculture Committee where efforts to remove the stabilization program failed, because an amendment that failed. If this committee is going to debate policies in the Farm Bill, especially things like the dairy market, then let's talk about having hearings where folks can be educated on these issues. Let's also talk about other issues like cuts to nutrition programs like SNAP. Why are we implementing studies to determine the impact on a necessary stabilization program for dairy that's good for farmers and consumers, but not studying the impact that indiscriminate cuts to SNAP will have on children, working families, and our seniors? Mr. Chairman, if we're going to have a debate on the Farm Bill today, let's have a debate on the impact of cutting free school lunches for 210,000 children. Let's have a debate on the impact that these cuts will have on over 50 million hungry people living in our country. This is not the time or the place for this debate. We should be working on issues relevant to the Judiciary Committee, like comprehensive immigration reform, updating the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, talking about the Marketplace Fairness Act. Our time would be better spent on these pressing issues rather than rehashing arguments from other committees. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment.
Lady yield?
I yield to.
Thank you very much, and we appreciate and understand your concerns that you've articulated. And your mention about some very important parts of the agriculture bill, certainly I would like to talk about too, especially SNAP, the food stamp bill. The only problem is that it's not in our jurisdiction, and so we would be far afield in trying to assert our jurisdiction under our rulemaking, under the rulemaking authority, and then go and violate our jurisdiction to talk about important, I agree with you, important agricultural issues that are not within the jurisdiction of the committee.
One of the things in this amendment includes studies on the impact of the Dairy Stabilization Program. If we're going to do studies on things, then let's do studies also on food nutrition programs. There's nothing unique to dairy in this particular case, and that seems to be singled out in this amendment. And frankly, this is an appropriate use of this amendment.
Would the gentlewoman yield?
Yeah.
I thank the gentlewoman for yielding. I just want to assure her that we do not take out the dairy stabilization program. In fact, we simply allow more public comment input by using the Administrative Procedures Act, which is the standard process for examining any new program, as well as the Congressional Review Act. So all we're asking is that when this program, if it is still in the Farm Bill, when the Farm Bill finally passes the House and the Senate, they work out their differences and pass a conference report and send it to the President, that when the department gets the new programs, and not just dairy, we haven't singled out dairy because new conservation programs in here and others are required to go through the Administrative Procedures Act. Now, a part of that process is to request that the agency do studies, but those studies do not dictate any outcome. The outcome might well be that this program will do great things, will reduce prices or will stabilize prices or do other things. It simply says that they should be studied so that as the rulemaking process is done, it can be done in a fair way with consumers, consumer groups, agricultural groups, dairy processors, and others have the opportunity to be heard on the issue. But it does not in any way impair what occurred in the Agriculture Committee in terms of having the dairy stabilization program in the Farm Bill. We don't have jurisdiction over that. We're not attempting to exercise jurisdiction beyond what this committee has jurisdiction for. And I want to assure the gentlewoman that I appreciate her concerns. We have a different point of view about the program, but that remains to be debated at a later time. And we welcome her views being expressed here, like mine were expressed here, but we don't have the ability to change the program other than to say it has to go through the normal rulemaking process that any new regulation should go through to give the public and interested parties the opportunity to have input.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman from, I don't have the time. The gentlewoman from Washington has the time.
I'll be happy to yield in a second.
I tell you what, the gentleman's time has expired, so maybe I should just recognize the
go
gentleman
ahead.
from Wisconsin.
Yeah, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Let me commend the chairman of the committee for exerting jurisdiction on this, irrespective of what the merits are. Prior to my chairmanship, we had 2 or 3 chairs, both Democrats and Republicans, that basically let jurisdiction go, and we lost jurisdiction over a lot of important things to other committees. Because once we let jurisdiction go, it is really very, very hard to get it back. I remember the first fight that I picked during my chairmanship was to get antitrust jurisdiction over telecoms back in this committee, because we have antitrust jurisdiction from top to bottom, and because Mr. Hyde, Mr. Brooks chose not to exert that jurisdiction, we lost it to Energy and Commerce. So what we're doing here today has something overriding into the power and influence of the Committee on the Judiciary that we had better protect, because if we don't protect it, we're going to lose it. And that's happened in the past, and we don't want to have that happen again. So having made that point, let me say good job, Mr. Chairman. Keep it up, even if we have to have more of these markups over just a short part of the bill, because if we don't do that, then all of a sudden we're going to find the Administrative Procedure Act and the public requirements of input go to another committee that really has no expertise in it. With that, I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'm reclaiming my time. I do yield to the chairman.
I appreciate the gentleman's comments and yielding. And I just want to say to the gentlewoman, again, to provide her assurance, the studies that are called for include the domestic or international government-funded nutrition programs, consumers, and competition in domestic dairy markets. So it covers, I think, some of the concerns the gentlewoman raised about what the impact of this program would have on various interested groups, including, most importantly, nutrition programs and consumers.
Would the gentleman?
I yield to the gentleman from Michigan.
I would like to just compliment both the chairman and the former chairman, Mr. Sensenbrenner, because these additional protections, I call them, were added as a result of our negotiation here in the judiciary. The nutrition programs, but we added consumers and competition in domestic dairy markets. And I think that's very important, and I think it makes it a better bill, and I thank the gentleman for yielding.
I now yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Are there further members seeking recognition on the amendment? If not, the question occurs on the amendment offered by the chairman. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. A reporting quorum, are there further amendments? A reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 1947 as amended without recommendation to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill as amended is ordered reported without recommendation. And that concludes our business today. I thank all of the members for their participation, and the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.